ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning and a warm welcome to all of you, as well as to our speaker for today, Mr. Lawrence Kong. Today's webinar is part of a series of webinars focusing on Malaysia's competitiveness, performance, and ranking as assessed and reported yearly by international organizations, namely the International Institute for Management Development, or in short called IMD, in their World Competitiveness Yearbook, also known as the WCY, and the World Economic Forum, that's the organization which in short is the WEF, in their own Global Competitiveness Report, or GCR in short. Yeah? So in the recent World Competitiveness Yearbook 2020, year 2020, that's the WCY 2020, Malaysia's competitiveness ranking has slipped to 27th position from 22nd in 2019. That's a drop of 5 positions out of 63 countries assessed by IMD. This overall competitiveness score and rank is calculated based on a total of 255 criteria. That's a lot of criteria there, comprising 163 hard data or statistics and 92 survey data. The survey data are obtained from a survey called Executive Opinion Survey, targeted at respondents from the industry, the business community, targeted at the middle management and senior management people. And these 255 criteria are categorized into the 4 competitiveness factors according to IMD's structure, according to the WCY report structure. And these are the 4 factors are the economic performance, government efficiency, business efficiency, and infrastructure. So in our webinar today, our speaker, Mr. Lawrence Kong, will be presenting on state ownership of enterprises, or in short, SOE, state ownership of enterprises, and whether these state ownership of enterprises are perceived in the business community as having a threat to business activities. And this particular criterion is part of the government efficiency factor. So before I hand over the session to our speaker, let me first introduce him. Mr. Lawrence Kong is a certified Six Sigma Master Black Belt and a quality and productivity trainer from NextMU Private Limited, which he founded in 2011. He's an engineer by practice, and prior to this NextMU, which he founded, Mr. Lawrence started his career in Motorola Electronics and worked there for 15 years before joining Motorola University's external training and consulting group as a Lean Six Sigma consultant. He has 20 years of extensive experience as a practitioner in teaching and sharing, project mentoring, coaching, and consulting to various companies which embark on business process management and also continuous improvement programs. In the last decade, he has been actively working with SMEs in Singapore in various productivity, innovation, and continuous improvement initiatives. He has provided consulting service in diverse industries so far, and functions also, just industries as well as functions, such as information communication, media and design, logistics and storage, electronics, precision engineering, general manufacturing, financial services, retail, food and beverages, admin and support services, university and academia, non-governmental organizations, construction, engineering, hospitality, aviation services, laboratory testing services, and also government and related government agencies. So with that, I now hand over the session to Mr. Lawrence.
Okay, thank you, PW, for the introduction. Let me start with this presentation today. It's on the SOE, State Ownership of Enterprises. The criteria is 2.419. The statement is that it's not a threat. SOE is not a threat to business activities. But we're going to explore why we score so low in a WCY 2020 World Competitiveness ranking. So let me walk you through in several steps so that you understand how this SOE perception as a threat to business activities are being developed. We'll be presenting key drivers. At the end, we will also suggest some recommendations for improvement to improve this perception. Let's look at how IMD collected the score from the survey from Malaysia. Basically, NPC is the partner who undertook the sampling of people we call surveyees from different industries representing different sectors in Malaysia. They went through a survey. So in this particular criteria, the survey has a scale of 1 to 6. So ranging from 1 to 6. 6 is the worst, I believe, meaning that the perception is that state ownership of enterprises is a threat, and then 1 that is not. So so these survey scores are being collected before transmitting to IMD. So what IMD did was that they compiled the average scores of this pool of surveyees. What they did was they then standardized the score by calculating the standardized value, standard deviation values of the average, so that they can then have a range of standardized score of 1 to 10. So they did the same to the rest of the economy, 63 economies. Then we are being ranked across the different economies in terms of the perception scores. So you can see in 2019, we were ranked 34. And then in 2020, our perception score is dropped drastically. You can see there's 14 points, displacement of the position. So you can see actually from 2017, we actually have an improvement starting to shift past 5 out of the standardized score of 10. But for some reason, the drop from last year was very drastic. So we're trying to find out what could possibly cause this drop in score. What we intend to do is to look at the perception. Is SOE or are SOEs in Malaysia really, posing a threat to the business activities here? We're looking at the core of these threats, whether it exists or existed. We also will look at the perception, how it's been formed by the survey, what kind of historical events or historical happenings that led to the survey believing that this is a threat to business activities. So we will try to define what threat is, and then we're trying to define what business activities are, so that we can then try to zoom into the different kinds of threats that possibly the SOEs are posing to the local scene. So we'll focus mainly on domestic business activities because we are trying to look into the business sector in this case. In Malaysia, we have different kinds of SOEs, state ownership of enterprise. So from now on, I'm going to use SOE to refer to state ownership of enterprises. The definition of SOE, not only in Malaysia, in many countries, is a mixed one. So to define where we're going to look into, we basically look into how our government defines SOEs. This is very much in line with OECD's definition, the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development definition for SOEs. In Malaysia, we have 2 types of SOE. Let me walk you through the first type. It's called Government Linked Investment Company. In short, we call them GLICs. Government Linked Investment Companies, they were incorporated by Ministry of Finance. The nature of the GLICs are basically they are investment holding company. So what the function of the GLICs is that they are basically statutory bodies managing our national wealth. Like for example, our or funds, for retirement, for example. So what they do is that they invest in other companies. They invest in other corporations to maximize the wealth, because they need to make sure the fund is positive, it's healthy, so that we get our fund as and when we need. So because they are government owned, government here will refer to the Ministry of Finance, because this is directly a ministry under the Prime Minister office, hence our government. So because they are government owned, there's a heavy influence from the ministry or the Prime Minister office through the Ministry of Finance to the boards of the GLIC. So this influence can extend to the senior leadership team of the GLIC. So what it means is that the government has the authority, the government has the control to appoint who the board should be, who the board members should be. There are many cases, the CEOs and the senior executives in the leadership teams, they are appointed by the government. So in turn, the boards and the senior leadership team, they receive guaranteed capital. Government will allocate part of the fund to these GLICs so they can manage them properly. So they also are guaranteed income because this is government linked. So it's a bit different from the private company. So in turn, these board members and SLTs, the senior leadership team, they report back directly to the government. You can see there's a close link on how the influence has been exerted from the top. And then this reporting is routed back to the government. Yeah, so this is GLIC. Now, the other kind of SOE is called GLCs. This is called the government link company. Government link companies is a little bit different from GLIC because unlike GLICs, they are investment holding companies. Mostly they are statutory bodies, but in GLCs, they are commercial in nature. So what they do is they are basically commercial companies. They are either incorporated, listed, or non-listed. Yeah, and the government can exert control as well to this commercial company. There are a number of ways government can exert controls to these companies. Let me walk through different ways because it can get quite complex. Even I myself get confused. So the commercial companies, they have boards and senior leadership team as well, the higher management, so-called. The Ministry of Finance can have control over these GLCs directly. Right? They can either have majority share in the shareholding, or they can have partial share, but they have what we call the golden share, even though they are not in a majority shareholder position, but they can have this veto control that's called the golden share to control the decision and the management of the commercial companies through the boards and SLT. Another way for the government to exert control is through other GLCs. So you can see GLCs can own other GLCs, So what these GLCs do is that they probably can own certain equities or shares, sometimes bonds of other GLCs. They can be in a major shareholding, minority, associates, subsidiary. These are all different forms of control the government can have to the commercial company. The other kind of control is what we're going to see later on, that the GLICs are basically the vehicle for the government to exercise their control onto the GLC. So through the GLICs, the government basically has a major stake in the GLICs, and the GLICs can own the GLCs. So you can see GLICs can own GLCs, GLCs can own other GLCs, government can directly control the GLCs. It can get quite complex. And the truth is, it is complex. Through this research that I was trying to find out more about the SOE, you're gonna be amazed at how complex the network of the cross ownership of these GLCs are. We're gonna unveil that in a moment. I hope now you have some idea about the SOE definition in Malaysia. So same like GLIC, when the government has control over the GLC, the government can make decisions on who they want to appoint onto the board. And not only that, the government can also enter into contracts, making certain decisions about the investment direction, giving awards or strategy direction to the company. You can see these are the major decisions the government can exercise on the GLCs when they have control. So part of the threat that we're gonna look at actually relates to all these decisions that the government can make, because when a government plants, an individual or a group of individuals to the GLCs or GLICs, it's very likely that these individuals are politicians. So we'll be looking at how politicians, in the last, at least a decade or so, how politicians are playing dual role in playing the social interest for public, as well as having commercial interest in making decisions on the investment directions of the company. So sometimes people see this as conflicting. Sometimes people see this as dual hat that we shouldn't be doing. We should probably leave the decision making of the commercial world to the professional. So we'll be talking more about the risk on some of the decisions that the government can make to GLICs and GLCs. Let me go through a bit of history in the GLIC. Actually, they had started even since we went through the independence. So let me show you the first role. You can see some of the GLICs, like for example, Ministry of Finance Incorporated. This was incorporated under the Act, Ministry of Finance Incorporated Act 1957. It was incorporated pretty much, early during the Independence Day. So the KWSP, our EPF, and the Tabung Haji, Lembaga Tabung Haji, they were incorporated around the same period of time. The original intent of setting up GLIC then actually was to harmonize with our national economic policy during that time. If you remember the national economic policy, the aim then is to bring up the wealth of the nation by eradicating poverty. So by doing this, we can create harmonious country through the GLICs, because we actually depended on the GLICs to manage our wealth of the country. Yeah. So through these GLICs, we were hoping the economy of the country can be restructured. Another intention of the GLICs was to address market failure. Market failure here means, for example, one of these failure can be employment, lack of employment. So with the creation of these GLICs, we can provide jobs, employment to many, locals. So in fact, actually, this is one of the success points of the government-owned enterprises, because basically they did, or they do, even as we speak today, provide a lot of jobs to Malaysians. Yeah. So in this provision of jobs, our nation wealth can be better. But you're going to see that how these GLICs are being called monster, even as recent as 2 years ago by our former Prime Minister. But let me walk you through the rest of the history, just so that you can understand where they came from. PNS, it was created during the second Prime Minister's period. So this actually was created based on transfer of funds from the MOF Incorporated. So the Tabung Angkatan Tentera Act, this is actually the funds for our military personnel. It was created under the Act of Tabung Angkatan Tentera 1972. Right? So this was created. Basically, this creation, at the time, it was very much focused in agriculture investment. At the time, our agriculture is booming, right? So we're still trying to fulfill the national economic policy to bring up the wealth. But at the time, one of the objectives is to also exercise action-based policies. That means to eradicate poverty for certain populations who were poor at the time. Yeah. So then, when it comes to the next regime, there was a transfer of PNS fund to a newly created PNB GLIC. It was created in 1978. So it wasn't until Muate's period, the KWDIP and the Khazanah were created, right? So it was until then we had the full suite of GLICs that we see today. That's how the network of these GLICs and GLC connections have been created. Yeah, so basically, Muate at the time he tried to nationalize a lot of foreign-owned companies by privatizing GLCs. By then, we already had quite a number of GLCs. Yeah, and the next Prime Minister then, but we actually inherited a lot of the GLCs, which are under control of the GLIC. So under Badawi's regime, he formulated a transformation strategy of the GLICs and GLCs. His aim was to turn the GLICs into global champions, right? So they could show a presence in the international trade team, right? So part of the transformation objective during Badawi's time was to remove politicians from the boards of the GLICs and GLCs. So that transformation objective had been one of the major drive of change in GLICs and GLCs to relinquish the control of politicians to state-owned enterprises. So the term that we normally hear, divestment, of GLICs, that actually refers to the removal of politicians from state-owned enterprises. Okay, so hopefully this will give you some idea about how the GLICs were formed. And this slide shows you how the control and ownership are for the GLICs under the ministry. So you can see, apart from PNB, which is wholly owned by the Yayasan Pelaburan Bumiputra, but the Ministry of Finance has a golden share in PNB. The rest of the ownership structure actually falls under the umbrella of Ministry of Finance. Yeah, like Tabung Haji, for example, the Prime Minister's Department, Islamic Affairs Department, also has some control over there. Plus MINDEF has some more control over the Lembaga Tabung Angkatan Tentera. Okay. This will give you some examples of which companies are termed GLCs and under which control of the GLIC. You can see these are the top GLCs. Once they were called the top performance of GLCs among the many GLCs. In fact, the questions that many have asked. How many GLCs do we have in Malaysia? We have answers here and there depending on which period you're looking at. On the website of Ministry of Finance, the Treasury website that manages the GLICs information, there are 71 GLCs currently under the control of the GLICs. But you can see from different sources, this number actually is underreported. Some actually report that they have quite a number, in fact more than 70, even as far back as 2013 period. So I'm going to show you some of the references later on that there are many studies around these GLCs and how they interlink and the effect of the trade scene and the investment scene. In fact, the number can go up to a lot, not just hundreds, but more than 1,000. Yeah. So that is not the topic we're going to explore. We're just going to show you some of the examples of the companies that you are familiar with. Right? You can see these companies fall into different sectors. They fall into different industries, both agriculture, non-agriculture, constructions, financial institutions, and so on. Okay. Now that we know what SOEs are in Malaysia, how do we define SOE? Let's define what trade, the word trade means, because trade to different individuals can mean different things. In our context over here, we recognize that trade basically refers to financial risk that company can face. So financial risk can refer to the capital and the loss of capital, or the poor cash flow a company can face. Normally, when we research what trade means to the private sector, majority of the answer that came out is the financial related trade. But we know financial trades are basically the lagging effect of other drivers. So we are trying to explore what causes financial trades. So then we can see, what are the threats that individuals may be thinking of when they went through the survey. Yeah. So you can see these are some of the common threats in organizations in the private sector. So all these threats, so synonymously we call them risk. We refer to the threats here to any risk that can cause, a risk in a financial situation of the company. So any risk here can mean, they can be internal, they can be external of the company. So things, for example, like what we saw, the government can exert control to appointing the board to a company. So sometimes the government may, make certain decisions to merge companies. So the merging imposes risk. So merger acquisition can be a risk that can affect the financial situation of the companies. So you can see the other risk can be resources risk. When they mobilize resource, we may have a lack of matching in resources. Strategic direction, strategic risk. The new process or new service or new product portfolio, marketing portfolio risk, compliance risk, quality risk. Because if you think about politicians trying to run a company, we do have a study that points to, the focus and priority may not be on the quality, on the productivity aspect of the company or the service of the product, but it's driven mainly by political interests. So many of the risks here, we probably can trace to different studies that try to document the uncovering of how they affect the GLCs and hence the private sector. Okay. So let me walk you through the key authorities and the policies that we have in managing this SOE. So by now, probably you are aware that the key regulator here is the Ministry of Finance, right? So they basically have the ultimate control of all the GLICs and the GLCs in Malaysia. So on the website of the Treasury, right, that's the department that that's under MOF, they list a suite of policies and regulations. Here on the page, you can see they are applicable to the government-owned enterprises. All right. Say, for example, the Companies Act 2016. This is very much applicable to GLCs. They are incorporated under the Companies Act. For example, the Financial Procedure Act. GLCs may be subject to following the financial procedures, like how they would make certain decisions in the procurement, how they will make certain decisions in payment, for example. Government Contract Act, for example, how they should enter into a contract, what kind of compliance they should follow. Some of these policies, you probably can get it on the web. So I believe you probably have seen some of this. Yeah? So I believe by now you have a general idea about SOEs, yeah, and how we define SOEs and how we define threats. So in general, how the common individuals perceive threats, what they are to the private sector. So the business activities here can refer to any of the activities that we talk about in the threats, page over there just now. So any activities that the corporation would embark on in the commercial world, basically to make money, to sell products, to sell services, for state body, basically to serve the nation in the best interest. How these are being threatened by the presence and the conduct of the SOE.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence, for the very enlightening and interesting introduction related to GLICs and GLCs and the history, a history of these state ownership or state-owned enterprises. I think now is a good time that we pause here for questions from the participants, from the audience. Yeah, if you have any questions related to what was just shared by Mr. Lawrence, please feel free to post your questions in the questions box or chat box of this webinar. So we'll wait for a while to see if there are any questions from our participants. While waiting, probably I will start off with the first question to our speaker.
Oh, okay.
So,
all right.
Yeah, it was interesting for me to look at the history of GLICs and also GLCs and the interlinkage. I mean, like you said, it's a very complex network and cross ownership of GLICs and GLCs or GLCs with other GLCs. So it's quite complex. But you also mentioned there are like top performance, top 20, I believe, performing GLCs in the country. So is there any GLC that's like a state-owned enterprise, GLC or GLIC, that is viewed as good in the eyes of the rakyat? They're never stained with any controversies, for example. Yeah, they have always been in the, let's say, in the limelight for the good things. Yeah, in the limelight of good things, rather than in the limelight for controversies. So, are there any? Can you share with us? Is there any good sort of a GLCs or GLICs here in Malaysia? Thank you.
The quick answer to that question is yes. We actually have success stories of some GLCs Probably many people may not know certain institutions or organizations are GLCs actually. So let me give you maybe a couple of examples who the good performers are. I'm not sure because I didn't trace all the history of all the GLCs. In fact, I don't even know who are the full list of GLCs. But one example can view as Axiata. Axiata is a very what do you call a high performer. Not only because they have achieved financial boost after the transformation, they also went through restructuring in their top management team. They actually employed professionals from the private sector who had experience in the related industry to run the company. The change in that structure actually was viewed as a positive move. Actually, it was set perhaps as an example to the rest of the GLCs who are yet to go through the transformation. Another example can be viewed as Maybank. Maybank has been very successful not only in financial wise, but in the social, in the corporate responsibilities, in the a lot of social welfare that we can see in the news. So I was actually going to share a bit more about how GLCs are being perceived. Like you said, we normally read good news and bad news, but we normally tend to remember certain news more than the other. I think the phrase that I was using is that good news travels on clutch, bad news have wings. Sometimes we say the bad news doesn't travel at all. No, the good news doesn't travel at all, but the bad news is like all over the place. So it's a good thing that you ask this question because we probably need to focus more on the positive examples of what we have done right in the GLICs and GLCs, particularly the GLCs, because they are the ones who are rightfully belonging to the private sector. Right? They are not statutory bodies. They probably have certain interest in the public sector, but not all the GLCs are in public sector. So I think if we discount the GLCs in public sector, who some have done very good job in managing our national wealth, sovereign wealth, for example, we need to bring them out to actually let people decide. Look, we have just like anything, we have good and bad in GLCs and GLICs, and not everything is bad. But sometimes you just have a bad apple that can spoil the whole basket. So sometimes we may not define properly when we say there's a threat to the business activities. What do you mean by threat? What magnitude do you mean? Do you refer to the public sector only, where the GLICs rightfully should be, or the GLCs rightfully should be, or you're referring to everything in general? So we'll explore more on that to talk about the drivers. But thanks for the question. I think this is a right question to ask to bring more awareness to people.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Yeah, agree with you on that point. Let's hear it from you for on the next part of your talk, and
Okay.
it will be interesting, I believe. And we will see if there are more questions from the any more questions from participants. At the moment, I don't have any questions. So I mean, from the participants, there are no questions yet. So let's continue. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let me continue then. I'm going to continue with the key drivers that I think might influence the perception of the surveyees in the WCY 2020. Let me first show you the GLIC and GLC structure. Yeah. So we can see the ownership and control of the GLCs are basically under the umbrellas of the GLICs. right? So most of these GLICs are actually under the control of the Ministry of Finance Incorporated. Yeah, so this is just a snapshot of some of the GLCs. They are under control and ownership of the GLIC. So normally you see in the news that we focus more on the G20, the top performer. So when we say top performer, mainly their financial performance related. But as we speak, the G20 is no longer G20 because of the merger. You probably can read about it in the news. It's now probably G17, right? Some of the former G20s are here. You can see they are no longer part of the G20 group. So probably now you probably will hear G17, for example. But what I want to show you is that you can see it's a very complex pyramidal structure. The pyramidal structure is such that you have a very ultimate control from one ministry that has its hands in almost everyone. I say almost everyone because we're going to look at how much the presence of the GLICs is in the local, let's say in the KL composite index, in the listed companies. Even just that pool, they already exert a lot of controls that spur the presence to even more than half, the population of the listed companies in the KLCI. So, because of this, complex control, the interlink and the cross-link control between and among the companies, you can see there's a very heavy presence. There's a very heavy presence of the government influence in almost all the industries. Right? If you just go and look at the list of GLCs, they can be in airlines. MAS is a GLC. The airports is also one. You can see I don't have to name all of them over here. You can probably go and see they're in almost any sector: oil and gas, telecommunications, postal, anything. Yeah. So the heavy influence actually is being criticized as something that's negative, because if you think about the nature of the GLICs, they control the GLCs, is to manage the national wealth. So because they need to maximize their wealth generation, they go into investment. Yeah. So because they have certain limitation in investing overseas, they basically focus their investment strategy in the local national markets, right? So hence, you can see in this last, I don't know how many number of years, the investment basically, was touched on by the GLCs. So the term that they use is that because of the heavy presence of the GLCs, they crowd out the rest of the private sector. So you can imagine if the government has already got a heavy presence in a certain industry, let's say for example oil and gas, there may be other players in the sector who is also in the same industry or even sector. They may not want to be in the same play field as the GLCs, because if you can imagine, they are probably in the minority. So they may not want to invest in the same area as where and what the GLCs are invested. So this kind of phenomena, the crowding out of the investment scene, is actually not good. So if you look at the 2018 statistics, 2018 in the KL Kuala Lumpur Composite Index, every 10 companies that are listed, 7 companies were GLC. So you can imagine how much they are crowding the local investment sector. Yeah. So this is not good because it brings about a risk that we call concentration risk. Concentration risk refers to when you are trying to invest in a certain portfolio that is so much crowded by a minority handful of decision makers and owners, what if there are certain sectors certain companies that are not doing well in the sector? So very, very likely when the performance of the investment is not good, it's very likely the GLCs will be affected because 7 out of 10 of the GLCs are in the sector. So the concentration risk is the risk that may pose to the business activities, because this risk may propagate, may be transferred to the other private sectors. Yeah. If you think about the investment strategy, the GLCs are controlled by the government. So we can believe that the investment strategy, they are heavily influenced by the government. By government, we mean political interests. For example, they may not be purely commercial interests. So the concentration risk actually is something that I would suggest also in the end to not look at just the local market. Perhaps invest in overseas market. Yeah, because the local market is so crowded, and when you have the interlinkage of the ownership, well, once you invest in this company, it's very likely you're investing in yourself. Right? So this is not good. Based on the OECD survey a while ago, I can't remember which year it was, probably it's a couple of years back, based on my research, they were looking into countries with SOEs, the countries with a heavy control proportion of the government into the GLCs, and how they affect the economy. All right, so they would they'll come up with this calculation, the weighted average of the share they invest in assets, right, in different things of the SOEs, and how this actually cause the pressure or the what do you call, the effect to the local economy. They rank the country. And guess what? Malaysia was ranked 5th in the world, right? The first, if I remember correctly, it was China, right? Followed by, I think it's Russia or Indonesia. We ranked 5th in the world, meaning that we actually had a lot of controls from the government to this GLC. And what the government do in the direction of the GLC actually will affect the local economy. And this is also a risk. So if we talk about the risk bearing, I'm going to show you the snapshot of some of the interlinks between the GLICs and the GLCs. And by far, this is not the complete picture, right? This is just a snapshot of some of the top performance, and you see it's already quite complex, right? Because of the heavy presence and the complexity, we also need to think about the risk bearing. Right, the risk bearing is high because if you have companies that are owned by politicians, right, and companies that are owned by, let's say, entrepreneurs, there's a different mindset between these two scenarios in terms of the kind of risk bearing they take. Imagine if there's a corporation that's owned by an entrepreneur, the mindset of running this company is very different from a politician who inherited the company from, let's say, the ministry. Yeah, the entrepreneur will run all out to make sure the survival of the company. The entrepreneur, if there's any risk coming along, would clutch at any straw. If you think about a drowning man, any straw is a safety device for him to clutch on to make sure the survival of the company is there. So this will excite innovation. This will excite creativity. This will excite the healthy risk that he's bearing or she is bearing to make sure the company will survive and flourish. Compared to non-entrepreneur with guaranteed fund and guaranteed salary and guaranteed capital to the company. Well, this mindset is not there, compared to the entrepreneur, because you won't die, to put it bluntly. Plus, when a company that is state-owned, there's always intervention from the boards. The interns, come from the government. So the intervention from the government to the board, the nature is very different from how an entrepreneur is running the company. So this risk is actually very real. If you look at the different GLCs they are running under the influence. So you probably can see what I'm trying to illustrate over here. Because of the intervention from the government, the boards can have different ties, directorate ties. What I mean is that the ownership structure of the directors of the GLCs may not be one director to one GLC, because the ties can be a multiple ties. The relationship between the directorate to the GLCs can be one politician can own many GLCs. So the strategic direction that this director makes to a particular GLC may be influenced by the interests of other GLCs. So this director may have multiple interests, including the political one, in making certain decisions for the strategic direction of the GLC. So that makes the intervention not something positive, because now you probably can speculate for possibly there's politically motivated intervention from the government in certain direction of the GLC. So let me show the next slide. Because of the guaranteed funds and guaranteed capital, there's a saying we always go like, if you are born with a silver spoon in the mouth, it's not necessary for you to be prudent about your capital that you manage. So in a way, it may not be true for all the GLCs, but again, we target the risk that this might pose when you have guaranteed funds from, let's say, our parent, Ministry of Finance. So if we have guaranteed funds, there are other risks as well, because the other risk that comes about can refer to how the boards run the company. Like say for example, let me go back to the last slide. Let's say the appointed CEOs or the appointed directors of the companies. Recently, probably you have heard about news how they were heavily remunerated, meaning they receive very high pay in their annual package. This pay, when compared to the private sector, the non-GLCs, even though some are lower, but it was claimed that their pay was more than 10 times higher than what the director or CEO should receive. So because of this, there were a number of CEOs or directors that went for early retirement, right? So they could receive a retirement package that was proportionally very, very high compared to the industrial standard. So you can see this also poses a risk. If we don't talk about the financial risk that's involved, because of the high remuneration, it may attract the wrong crowd, because you may not have the right match of talent to run a company, as one director leaves. So when they need to look for a replacement, guess what? The vicious cycle continues, because another individual will be planted with the intervention, so that this, next individual will run a company probably the same way. So the wrong match of talent, the risk of talent mobility, the mismatch of talent, these are all the risks that are resulted because of the heavy intervention from the top. And because of the way these individuals who are not professionals how they run a company, they may make certain decisions to heavily invest when they shouldn't. So as a result, they may borrow more than they could repay. So another risk that we keep hearing in the news is that GLCs are very much over leveraged. They have this over leveraging issue. That means they have borrowed a lot, but they cannot repay back. Hence, they go into debt. Yeah. So this is another risk that we could have if it's not properly controlled. Another risk is the unfair advantage. The unfair advantage here refers to how the commercial companies are being funded, or the opportunities they are given to them in certain contracts or even certain procurement. In private sector, what we advocate is the level playing field. Yeah? A level playing field will make sure that we have equal opportunity in generating wealth in the same level of competitiveness. Yeah. So when you have guaranteed fund, for example, from the government, the GLCs, they have a high level advantage when it comes to a few things, like for example, awarding of contract, for example. For example, in the case when a GLC is not performing well, we've seen in history that they were bailed out by other GLCs or by the GLICs because of the multiple ties relationship that GLIC and GLC have. The government can make decisions to transfer funds across GLCs. So you can see in the recent case, in fact, it has been dragging for years. MAS, for example, they did not perform well. Khazanah has bailed out MAS, I think more than once. So if you look in the history between 2001 to 2014, in more than 10 years, how much have we spent to bail out MAS? 17.4 billion ringgit. There is a massive amount of money to be transferred from a sovereign wealth fund organization to bail out, a GLC. Now, why we say it's unfair advantage? Well, let's imagine if we have another case of AirAsia or Malindo Airline. They also went into financial problems. Would our government do the same to these companies? Although it has not happened, but I will bet that this is probably not likely going to happen. So the unfair advantage that the GLC experience actually decreases the competitiveness. It makes sense because the GLCs were created. How the ownership was created is based on the initial objective of non-competitiveness. Their focus basically was placed upon the local domestic market. It's designed with a domestic objective to primarily orientate around the domestic market. So that's why, they probably we start to see they start to venture out to overseas investments. I think we talk about, what happened in the history that formed the perception of people saying that they are a threat. Well, historically, they are not having a lot of presence in the cross-border trade. So if we even link to WTO, World Trade Organization, the bilateral trade, the multilateral trade, actually the protectionism that we have in this country also, being influenced by the presence of the GLC because we need to protect the GLC. So there are certain policies that we have, the legal framework and the policy framework that we have in trade, in the cross-border trade, are influenced by the GLC's presence and how they operate in the cross-border trade. Trade as in trading. Right. So even though this is poorly documented, we're still trying to find out more. I hope there will be more scholars go into this area to uncover the relationship of GLCs and trade. But in terms of investment, there are actually many academics who have done the study and even proven empirically how the GLCs are crowding out the investment sector. Okay. Another risk that we keep hearing is the efficiency, that the GLCs are less efficient than the private sector. We talk about the entrepreneurship and the politician running the GLCs. We also look into how the mindset, how they are different in terms of running the organization. Entrepreneurs will tend to do everything to go all out, to make sure the organization will prosper. But if you are already guaranteed with funds, you probably may not focus that much in efficiencies, in productivity. You may have lacks in mindset to control costs, for example. We have seen in numerous reports that the cost of administration is high in GLCs, the efficiency is low in GLCs, the quality of the services are not as good as the private sector. You have probably heard many of these comparisons between GLCs and private. So we probably shouldn't have to go in too much in this. Yeah. And one of the things they talk about is the moral hazard risk. Moral hazard risk that is experienced by the owner of the company who are entrepreneurs or not. If you are not, possibly you may not be so worried, if it's not doing well. So another risk is referring to the financial practice. So according to my research, the procurement done in the government sector, normally it should be going through a platform called e-perolehan. Yeah, this was put in place many years ago. Based on the articles that I read, more than half of the procurement are done. Not everything. Why is that? Why is there still 45% still done based on conventional process and not through the e-perolehan platform? If you have a platform that was created to make sure that there's transparency in the conduct and the practice of procurement, I think it should be practiced. If you still have close to half the proportion of the procurement done outside this platform, we might have transparency problems. So possibly when you see, violation of the practice over here, probably may lead to some kind of embezzlement. Transfer of funds where it shouldn't be, false claims, backdoor deals. This could be opportunities for fraud. When you don't have a full compliance on the platform that you already put in place in the first place to curb this fraud. So this is actually a risk. If you have interventions from the top that is not following the proper compliance. All the GLIC have been involved in national controversy. This is based on a few studies that are very commonly done. Even a lot of them were reported in the news. One of which is still probably haunting us, the one NDB. Probably this is the big elephant in the room that we keep thinking about when we think about GLC. But all the GLICs in the past, for example, asset shifting between the GLIC, and it wasn't explained properly why the asset was shifted, possibly in bailout, but the public needs answer why the public funds are being shifted in certain decisions for the benefit of certain companies. So this lack of transparency actually linked to scandals. Land scandals, purchase scandals, construction scandals, you name it. We probably have a whole suite of this kind of thing documented. The government knows about all the problems in GLICs and GLC. It's not like they're ignorant. They know about it. They created a transformation program as early as 2005. This program took 10 years to complete. Yeah. The intention of the transformation program was to divest the presence of politicians in GLCs and also to replace them with industrial professionals, to replace them with the able talent, to increase productivity, to increase efficiency, to increase financial performance, to strengthen their boards, to have a presence in cross-border trade. They even created an academy called Malaysian Directors Academy to train the directors, to train the senior management individuals to how to properly run company. They created policy handbooks to document how the proper practice should be in accordance to the good governance in corporation. These are all the good things that they have achieved in a 10-year transformation. Right? If you go to the website, they have reported successful graduation of the transformation program in the 10 years. However, the public have diverse views on the graduation of the transformation programs because they are being judged by their action and not what they reported. In fact, what they reported, many claim that it's rosy because they still invest heavily in the investment sector during the divestment program. When they say they would divest out the politicians, only a few happen in GLCs, but not all. And they only reported the top 20 GLC performance. And there are many other GLCs that are not included in the programs. So they are still crowding out the investment. They are still dominating the economy. They still account for a large proportion of the market capitalization, which is more than half. If you look at Bursa Malaysia, a lot of them who are listed, the top 100, a good more than half portion are GLCs. Yeah. So because of this, good and bad outcome of the transformation program, the term crony came about. Right. There's a popular reference to this term called crony capitalism. We still don't follow what we say we would, and scandals and corruption still happen. So this probably would play a large role in affecting the perception of the industrial representatives who undertook the WCY survey. So if we look into the surveyees, they are individuals like you and me. So when they look at the survey items, SOEs are threats to business activities. SOE are not threats to business activities. Which one should they favor? All right. You and I, we are emotional beings. So a lot of times we base on what we remember. Right. Sometimes we are very heavily influenced on media. So we may be, having media bias. When it's present, we might not know about it. So sometimes we base on the most recent news in our mind to answer the survey question. So, unluckily, if the individual reads something bad about GLC, the item will be scored badly. Yeah. So the negative bias that is present in the surveys, like we talked about just now, right? We tend to remember negative things more than the positive things. Yeah. We may have certain fallacies, like for example, we may have a tendency to associate, events that probably may not have strong correlation, or we associate them to have connection. So we may associate certain news that we read to be linked to GLICs or GLCs. After all, we hear a lot of bad things in the news. News tends to want to sell based on sensation and based on exaggeration. So sometimes this kind of cognitive bias that we have may influence the way we judge the SOE's track objectively. we can't blame the survey, because how would a survey, cast a score, when we don't even know how much magnitude of the threat we talk about. What specific threat are we talking about? What specific business activities are we talking about? Are we referring to GLICs? Are we referring to the GLCs? Are we referring to all of them? We can think about the worst case of all of this. But again, not all individuals who undertook that survey will think on the same page when answering this question. So again, there might be other external factors, like how the sampling was done. The sampling methodology could have changed, before 2020 compared to 2019 or the years before. This remains a suspect. But again, it's depending on where you want to tackle this problem, because this problem can be quite massive to address. So to look at the mother of all key drivers, let me come to the last point over here. It's the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability, to the public about the government information. Public needs to know the truth. Public has the right to know the truth. So when it's not published, public will keep guessing. So when you do not know much about a thing, you tend to think about the negative, aspects of the thing. So I think this is a bias that most of us have without knowing. It's pretty difficult to address this, because we don't even have an act or a decree to declare transparency to public about government information. We have an act about false news. We have an act about, disclosing secrets that we shouldn't, but we don't have an act about transparency and disclosure to the public. I think this probably is the roots of why the public at large still think negatively about the GLCs and GLICs, because they represent the government. Yeah. So if you look into the corporate governance of the GLCs and the GLICs, basically what we found is that how the corporate governance is adhered to depends largely on the legal forms of the GLC. Yeah, so legal forms here refer to whether the GLCs are listed, publicly listed, or they are corporatized but they are not listed, or they are statutory bodies like the GLIC. Now let's break it down one by one. If we talk about the publicly listed GLC, well, of course they are listed, let's say under Bursa Malaysia, right? So because they're listed under Bursa Malaysia, Bursa Malaysia has many listing requirements, right, in different chapters, right? So they basically have to go into chapter 9 to follow the periodic reporting of the financial performance, the non-financial performance, right, for publicly listed GLCs. For the corporatized GLCs that are not listed, well, they are not as strict as the listed companies. If they are corporatized under the Companies Act 125, that means they have to go through the annual reporting and auditing, and present it in their AGMs, and they have to present it to the registrar of companies according to the Act. But they are not required to publicly disclose their reporting to the public. Yeah, so even though the public can still get access to the financial reporting, not directly, but you can, with the price you pay from the Companies Commission Malaysia, you can buy or download their financial reporting on their return, right? The financial return, and all these reporting are done according to the Malaysia Accounting Standards Board, right? So there are few reporting standards MASB has, one of which is the MFRS, the Financial Reporting Standards. The GLCs, they are not listed, can follow this standard. Yeah. So when I say can, means they may not follow this standard. They can follow standards that are, approved by MASB. But this MFRS is only one of them. Yeah. If you talk about a statutory body, we have statutory bodies, Act 240, in terms of the conduct and discipline and reporting. There are two acts altogether that governs how statutory bodies should report the account every year, right? So every year they have to get the Auditor General to audit the report and give the report, and this report will be presented to the responsible minister, and the minister will have to present this in the parliament, right? So the statutory body is a bit strict in that case because they have got acts to govern how this will be reported. But the risk about all this is that if you look at the statutory bodies, even though they have got Auditor General report, if they do it in the year, they may not have an external independent auditor because they don't have to, right? They could just get the Auditor General report submitted. There's no external independent third party to audit, what has been reported, right? So that is a risk over there. If you look at the non-listed corporation, even though they have got their annual report based on the MFRS, they don't have to disclose it to the public because it's not mandated. The other thing that is not mandated to these companies is that they are not mandated to have to establish internal auditing system. So they don't have internal auditing system to appoint external audit body. So they are not mandated to do this. If you look into the publicly listed companies, they have to follow the Chapter 9 of Bursa Malaysia, but there's no periodic rotation of the external audit firm. So they could basically go with any firm. They could corroborate, with the reporting. We have seen in history that there were controversies because of the audit firms that are influenced or they are being terminated based on the interest of the publicly listed companies, especially the board. Yeah. So because there's no coherent reporting format across these different legal forms, it poses a risk. In fact, it poses more than a risk. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to a few things. Transparency. It's a challenge to the comprehensive information disclosure to the public. It's a challenge to the reporting system. I can think of these three risks. I mean, this is already big enough that pose loopholes to controversies and risk to the organization. So, because of all this complex structure and the lack of transparency, OECD, the organization who is pretty much have an interest in looking into SOE's governance in countries, they call Malaysia's SOE framework decentralized framework because we still have not met some of the definitions that the OECD has set, to have what you call a uniform reporting of all the GLCs, not just financial reporting, but non-financial information as well. And we still do not have disclosure, right? Disclosure on both financial and non-financial reporting of GLCs. This reporting has to be coherent. It should have a standard, framework and standard legal form to report all the GLCs within this umbrella. We don't have this centralized way of reporting yet. This also poses a risk because some can perform better, some may not be performing at all. So another reporting is called aggregate reporting. The OECD focuses on this reporting as well because aggregate reporting not only talks about financial reporting, it talks about risk, how the collective risk that the organization may see in affecting the financial situation of the company. So some of the things in the aggregate reporting can refer to how the GLC interacts with each other. Say, for example, how GLC procure services from the other GLC, and how the relationship is, between the stakeholders. So, is there harmonized relationship? Is there any threat? This need to be included in the aggregate reporting, and we don't have it. Yeah. So this is a risk that we still have for the GLCs and GLICs. Just to compare, based on the OECD survey every year, right? This is taken from 2020. Just to compare where we fare among different economies across the corporate governance, the transparencies, the disclosure, the aggregate reporting, the disclosure of the financial and non-financial reporting, stakeholder relations. You can see these are neighbors. Indonesia, even though they have very heavy influence of government in their SOEs, but they have put in place a good coverage of all these corporate governance. Right? Korea, Philippines already has put in place, all the necessary governance measure according to the good governance practice as recommended by OECD. Right? Countries like Sweden, Denmark, they are way above us. Yeah. Even Korea in Asia is one of the best in terms of reporting their SOE performance. Talking about reporting SOE performance, China has a website that gives a dashboard on all their SOEs, not just financial reporting, but the progressive events, the decisions, the directions of the investment. They have this kind of reporting, which is accessible by the public. So this is especially important because we are talking about just one criteria, right? I have done some mapping, what we just talked about, from the lack of transparencies, the heavy influence, the heavy control, and the complex ownership, all the way to the surveys, negative bias. You can see the relationship here is actually related. It's present across all the different drivers. So what I'm saying is that all these drivers affect the survey in giving bad score to the survey item. This criteria, how SOE is posing a threat. What should we do? We could address from the left end, manage the survey, or we could go to the core and try to solve the systemic issue. If you look into the two different spectrums, I think we should go into the right-hand side, to look into how this should be addressed from the core. Yeah, because by doing so, we not only can improve the criteria here, but we can also improve many other criteria in the work competitiveness indicators. Right. So I shouldn't have to bore you with the details in this, but what we found is that there is indeed correlation between the different indicators. If we do well in, say, for example, protectionism, bureaucracy, transparency, we'll do well here as well, because all these are linked when it comes to the perception. When an individual perceives that we're doing well in transparency, for example, we're doing well in managing our SOE, for example, there are many other indicators that could be scored well as well. Yeah. So comparing Denmark, which is ranked number 1 in this criteria, you can see the related indicators, they score very well. All right. But if you look at our Malaysia ranking, because we also rank, mediocrely in other indicators, this indicator is not really scored well. Yeah, so what should we do? Let me walk you through this slide. I have put together 5 top recommendations. I think we could improve the perception. This is not easy because the government already has, knowledge about, what we should do. That's why they created a 10-year transformation program. But I think some of the things can be enhanced. Some of the things can be still revisited, not replicating the transformation program, but to zoom into certain areas, like for example, create a centralized ownership function of the GLC. Since we already have the pyramidal structure, why can't the same pyramidal structure hit, impose some kind of centralized influence as well as reporting, most importantly, as well as creating the same kind of corporate governance framework, because some are already doing quite well, some are not there yet. We can benchmark, some group of former GLCs and see how to replicate this good governance practice across all the GLCs and create transparency, right? So make this accessible to the public, right? So again, at the same time, we should stop appointing politicians to the board of GLC, continue to enforce on the divestment strategy of the GLC, so we can reduce the complex network of the GLC. So hopefully by doing this, the term monster won't be there anymore. We should recognize that there is a monster and we should tame it. I think this should create a way to do this. Now my last slide talks about some of the ministries in Malaysia who already recognize that we already have this problem, and they are already involved in constant communication and discussion with OECD. Like for example, Khazanah is already in the group, knowing that there's a representative from GLICs who is taking interest in improving GLICs and GLCs. Actually, is a good one, because they recognize that the government recognizes that there is a problem with GLIC and GLC. Other ministry like National Planning and Economic Development, the MINDA, that was created during the transformation program, ideas who have been advocating on the divestment as well as the improvement of GLCs, Institute of Corporate Governance, and the Watchdog Group. So hopefully this sharing can give you a bit of knowledge about what's currently happening in Malaysia, what SOEs are, and how they might have influenced, the perception of many individuals like you and me. Hopefully, we should pay close attention to the development and improvement of GLCs and recognize our bias. Yeah. So I think with that, I end my sharing.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Really for a very good, interesting, and very insightful talk, and also sharing related to state ownership of enterprises and how they are perceived, whether being a threat or not to business activities in the country. So let's open to questions from participants. If you have any questions, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and we'll pick it up and I will relay the question to Mr. Lawrence for him to answer. Anyone, please? This is your opportunity to ask questions after all the interesting information, the history, the background, I don't know, all the controversies, maybe the complexity of the whole thing is like a monster, like Mr. Lawrence shared.
Yeah, we could have talked about the controversies, the bad news. I think those will be more interesting for listeners to listen to. But I think we should look at it objectively.
Yeah, maybe I start with a question that's on my mind now. I mean, I like that slide you shared with like the post-it stickers, and then you mentioned about whether we want to start with the left-hand side, the bias and fallacies of the surveyees, or we should start on the right-hand side, looking at the the root causes, so to speak. So I remember you shared just now about corporate governance of SOEs, and there is this maybe a few components, many components related to good corporate governance, related to transparency and accountability. But Malaysia is faring very poorly on all those components. It's like we don't have any of those components as compared to other countries. The other very interesting thing, the other very interesting thing you mentioned or you shared is the correlation between this particular criterion with so many others. Quite a number. This quite a number of other criteria in the WCY that they are interrelated. There's correlation, and if we can improve this particular SOE criteria or criterion, it will help in also contributing to the improvement in the others. So that I think is very interesting, and I fully agree. For example, if we talk about transparency, there's a criterion on transparency. There's criteria on bribery and corruption, on protectionism. All these are, what we have heard, the negative things related to GLCs in the past. So with
actually,
that,
you're right.
I'd like to maybe ask this question related to politicians being appointed to the board of directors of state ownership of enterprises. I remember you shared about during Abdullah Ahmad Badawi's time, or previous Prime Minister Badawi's time, there was this divestment, so to speak, to remove politicians and then put in non-politically related people on the board of GLCs and GLICs. So was there any correlation? I can't remember whether that was successfully done or it was not even started at all. And was there a correlation with the performance of Malaysia in this criterion in the WCY? And then relating back to recent situation in Malaysia, probably in the early part of this year, we see in the news that politicians are being sort of like rewarded, and being appointed to the board of directors of multiple state-owned enterprises as like a reward for them. So this like making us go back one step, go back to the previous situation and causing it worse in terms of perception of the public, or more specifically the middle management and senior management respondents of this executive opinion survey. So what's your view on that, Mr. Lawrence?
Okay, this is a very interesting view. I was also looking into the correlation between the time when we had the transformation program to an outcome, for example, on the investment, how our investment fare during and after the transformation program. Did we do well after the transformation program, or did we go back, like you said, we take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, I do see some kind of correlation, even though I don't have a full study on this. It's basically based on the numbers that I've seen. Like you said, but Badawi's time, he had introduced the transformation program, and part of the objective is to drive out the politicians from the board. This program was not fully completed because when the next prime minister took over the office, basically he looked upon the GLC's function as a very different one. So the original objective of the transformation program during Badawi's time was not fully completed. So even though the transformation program went through the time they did, the top 20 GLC's financial performance actually went up. Yeah, and after the transformation program, the investment sector performance also went up a bit. I saw after 2015. Yeah, but then it dropped again. So you can see, I'm not sure whether this slide does tell us something. You know, you can see 2015 was the year when our transformation program completed. The top 20 GLCs graduated from the transformation program, and they reported very impressive gain and boost in performance. They had a framework, a policy on the governance, on what they should do and what they shouldn't do. It continues to drop the perception, you know. But until 2017, of course, as the case, they probably need time to change the perception for some interesting reason. 2017 to 2019, the perception went up. So I believe we probably might have done something right over here, you know. But if you just talk the the regime of Prime Minister, how GLCs has been used as a political tool in the political activities versus how we fare then, it's rather interesting. I believe there could be other factors that are compounding this kind of behavior. Yes, to answer the question, I do see there's a change, and there's certainly some kind of connection from how our information from the government is affecting the activities here that change the perception. Of course, with the recent pandemic and so on, there are external environmental factors that affect it as well. So with the change of government during that time, we also affected it as well. So hopefully this gives some information on what I thought.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, still waiting for to see whether any questions from the audience. Okay, looks like there are no questions so far, and looking at the time also, I think that's it for today. Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Lawrence. Really,
thank you,
very
PW.
educational. Yeah, educational, and trigger back a lot of memories. But unfortunately for me, I would say trigger more the negative type of negative type of memories rather than positive in relation to state ownership, enterprises, and the news surrounding them. Yeah. So hopefully going forward, we will be able to like based on your suggestion, your top 5 recommendations or suggestions, if we implement them, and some of them already proven, right, based on the benchmarking studies that you have done, what other countries have done in terms of managing the SOEs. So if Malaysia were to benchmark these countries' best practices and move forward accordingly, I think we will be able to change the perception of the business community in the future. So with that,
let's hope that happens.
Yeah, thanks again, Mr. Lawrence. Thank you to participants who attended this training today. This webinar today. And we'll see you again in next webinar in our long series of webinars related to Malaysia's competitiveness, in the eyes of international rating agencies. Thank you, and have a good day to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.